Hi, I'm Ryan Szymanski, curator for Battleship New Jersey Museum and Memorial. Today, we're going to be talking about the Marines. Throughout most, but not all, of Battleship New Jersey's career, she had a Marine detachment embarked on board. This is something that's far less common today, but is very traditional in the Navy. So, for those of you who don't know, the United States Marine Corps is similar to the Army, but they fall under the Department of the Navy. So under the Secretary of the Navy, you have the Chief of Naval Operations and the Commandant of the Marine Corps, and they each have their own branch there under the broader big Navy. The Navy, of course, does ships and most aviation, while the Marines duplicate things that other branches do. They have an amphibious force that has a much higher esprit de corps and special training and equipment for amphibious landings. The Marine Corps also has its own aviation assets that support it, both helicopters for landing troops, moving supplies, and fighter bombers and other transport aircraft that can be embarked on carriers or amphibious attack ships and support the Marines. As envisioned, the Continental Navy was emulating the British Navy, and the Royal Navy has a Royal Marine Force assigned with it, as do most navies. And part of the idea was that you've got a separately trained fighting force that can prevent mutiny among the sailors. Living conditions on ships were not great in the 17th and 18th century, particularly with the British impressing seamen into service. So mutinies were heavily feared. So the Marines had a separate command structure on the ship, separate training, and they usually slept near their weapons and between the enlisted sailors and the ship's officers in the wardroom, so that if there was a mutiny, it would likely be the sailors rising up against the officers, and the Marines and sailors didn't like each other.
There was some tension between the Marines and the sailors because they were always doing alerts. And so they would do drills all the time, and they wanted us out of the way, and they wanted to respect that they were Marines on the ship and that we needed to adhere to their commands and what they told us to do. And it can happen at any moment that there's a suspect on the ship or something like that, and we have to get out of the way, and they're running full speed to try to get to their quarters.
And so the crew would have a set of Marines to protect them. So typically, a ship would have about 10 or 15% of its complement be the Marine Corps during the Age of Sail. Going into modern days, you never let progress stand in the way of tradition, and so Marines were still embarked on ships. And so Great White Fleet era and early World War I era dreadnoughts continued to carry Marines and land them to interdict in other countries' affairs as part of gunboat diplomacy. And so this would be a mixed force of professionally trained Marines and sailors from the ship's crew armed with weapons from the Armory that were usually enough to overpower local tribes or less developed countries. So for example, the United States intervenes extensively with Caribbean nations and Mexico during this time period. During World War II, Battleship New Jersey still had a Marine detachment embarked. And this space where we're in right now is where those Marines would be. There isn't much evidence for it because by the 1960s, it was mostly obliterated. So normally, the barbette for turret 2 behind me would have had brackets mounted on it for the Marines' rifles to be stored there. That was all ground off when the Marines were removed from the ship, and by the time they were returned to the vessel, their weapons would have been stored in a separate armory. There has never been a successful mutiny on a U.S. Navy ship, and so the threat of that is significantly less than it was during the Age of Sail. So the job of the Marine Corps has changed somewhat. There is still some evidence in this space. The head behind us, the crew's washroom here, still has a nameplate over the door from World War II that says it was the Marine Corps washroom. And typically on the American fast battleships, this berthing compartment on second deck around the turret 2 barbette was the Marine Corps berthing space. So you can't really see it as such on Battleship New Jersey, but if you go to one of the older battleships, North Carolina, Alabama, Massachusetts, you will get to see this space more like it would have been with them on board. Right now, it's got the 80s style coffin racks and lockers, so it's very different from what our Marines would have known, and it even has an air conditioning system, which is exceedingly different from what the ship's World War II and Korean War era Marines would have known.
Well, I think it was pretty boring, but it's punctuated by moments of sheer terror.
So, the ship had Marines embarked during World War II and the Korean War, as was common during the time period. During the Vietnam War, Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara was pretty big on efficiency. So on his initiative, the Navy removed Marines from many of their ships, including not assigning any to Battleship New Jersey, so that the full force of the Marine Corps could serve in Vietnam. You weren't wasting manpower having them do ceremonial and police duties on ships when you have sailors who can do that just fine. However, in the 1980s, for reasons we'll talk about later on in the video, Marines are again assigned to the ship. And how do we know where they were berthed then? Maybe it's all the red and gold paint. Maybe it's Mardet and Punisher skulls stenciled everywhere. Or maybe it's the Marine Corps stickers all over the place. We are currently back aft around turret 3 on third deck. Most of the berthing on this ship is outside of the armored citadel, but for whatever reason, there is a set of berthing spaces that was put in back here. It's got its own washroom back there. It's got its own barbette, just like the Marines enjoyed during World War II in Korea. And for some reason, in the 80s, on this ship in particular, the Marines were assigned here. That's not the case for all of the Iowa-class battleships in the 80s. Their Marine Corps berthing spaces varied from ship to ship. So, on this side, we've got berthing space. We've got a first aid station, a battle dressing station. We've got a lot of air conditioning machineries. We are very close to the ship's propulsion plant, and the auxiliary diesel generator room is directly below us, and a bunch of magazines below us and behind us. So there are a ton of air handling units and other air conditioning accessories back around these spaces. Like I said, the head's on this side, and as we head out into the passageway, you can see a better idea of where we are. So, here we are at the aft end of Broadway, just above the hatch that leads down to auxiliary diesel generating room, or the aft machinery room. And if you've seen pictures of Iowa, you'll notice that this space is a little bit different between Iowa and the other 3 Iowa-class battleships. On Iowa, when you step through that door, there is a square cutout in the deck, and then you step up back here. On the other 3 vessels, they just plated it over from the doorway. Don't ask why. Anyway, you can see that Broadway has a black and white color scheme, and as soon as you get back here to the spaces the Marines are in charge of, we get a lot of red and gold around the borders. They're not subtle, these guys. Also, if you look at the 2 scuttlebutts here, you'll notice adhesive from where there used to be a large sticker. This would have been a big globe and eagle Marine Corps sticker on each of these scuttlebutts. I have no idea why it was pulled off or when, presumably after the ship left service. So if any of you guys happen to have a pair of approximately 10-inch circular globe and anchor stickers that you'd like to send us, I would love to reattach them here so visitors coming down Broadway know that this is Marine Corps berthing. There is a auxiliary Marine Corps berthing space on the tour route where if they had overflow berthing, they could assign people there. And we're fairly certain it's Marine Corps berthing because all of the other bunks on the ship have the seat belts removed. So the coffin type racks of the 1980s have a strap that you can buckle in along the side so that in heavy weather you don't roll out of your beds. That's not really an issue on battleships, and sailors tend to not use those. So they're removed in almost all the berthing spaces, except for this particular one. So that was the theory that the Marines retain theirs, which we do see on some of the racks down here, while the sailors had deleted them. Now, speaking of overflow berthing, we talked just a minute ago about how the Marines were not assigned to the ship during Vietnam. That's a big prestige thing for captains of Navy ships to have a Marine Corps attendant or guard outside of their cabin.
Other than general quarters, you have to go, you have certain assignments, and I was assigned a orderly for the captain and also Admiral Halsey and Admiral Spruance. That was our tour duty. And then if everything was going along all right and the general quarters wasn't sounded, then you went on your gun duty. So you fit in, the sergeant assigns you your details. It could be different every day.
And our Vietnam era captain, J. Edward Snyder, grew up during the World War II era. He's a World War II veteran. He fought at the Battle of Surigao Strait, the last battleship on battleship engagement. And so he may have felt personally miffed by not having Marines assigned. In any event, the man knew crew morale like no one else. And of course, during the Vietnam War, morale is a critical issue throughout the services. So he did what he called Operation Hilton, of course named after the hotel chain, where he's got a ship, a large ship with a lot of room, and a galley that can cook food, and a lot of beds and showers. So he would bring Marines from Vietnam onto the ship, give them a hot shower, which they couldn't get in the field, a hot meal, which they couldn't get in the field, and a place to sleep that wasn't being shelled by the Viet Cong every night.
At one point in time, we had some Marines and Army guys who came on board for R&R, and this one fella asked if he could have an extra piece of cherry pie. So I didn't give him an extra piece, I gave him the whole pie, and I got in a little bit of trouble for that.
There was a steady flow of Marines coming on board, and the first thing they did was to get a hot shower. They brought their own clothes for a change, but I remember them coming on board and literally lining up to take a shower, because some of them probably hadn't been clean in weeks. But the other thing was, we had good food. There was not any time that I can remember when we didn't have good food on that ship.
And so those Marines did jobs around the ship, and even though they were not assigned to the ship, some of them would have escorted the captain around on various occasions. So that's how Captain Snyder worked around the system and helped with the overall force morale at the same time. So while we're talking about the Vietnam era, you guys have probably been watching some of the oral histories we've posted, and we tend to do oral histories of this ship's crew, but on occasion, when somebody comes back and says that they served ashore but have a New Jersey-related story, such as Marines who came on board as part of Operation Hilton, or Marines who were ashore and called for fire support from the battleship, you'll see that they were very, very grateful for what the battleship did for them. And that's another reason, and that's one of the reasons why the Marines were brought back on board in the 80s. They had their own set of radio equipment that they stored on board, and they could be landed ashore to provide gunfire spotting for the 16-inch guns if needed. During the Vietnam War, there were already Marines ashore who came under enemy fire, and they called for gunfire support from Battleship New Jersey and the other ships on the gun line, but none of them could do quite what New Jersey could do. They called for support from this ship a number of times, and Battleship New Jersey saved countless lives during her single Vietnam deployment. This is the same Mardet space, just entered through a different door. And this is the Marine Sergeant's area. So there are 2 coffin racks here. They're in the same pattern as the chief petty officers get. There's the larger lockers, and there's a weapons safe. We're going to talk a little bit later about where the bulk of the Marine Corps weapons are, but here is one of the typical weapons safes on board the ship. This would have been something they could grab in an emergency and hand out on their way up to their actual armory, which we're going to in a minute again. And like I said, there are safes like this throughout the ship for different sailors of the Master-at-Arms group. They tend to be painted gray and not Marine Corps red, but it's the same general pattern. During the 1980s commission, the ship would have had the equivalent of 2 rifle platoons on board. There would have been a Marine Corps captain in charge, and probably another officer or 2, and then a handful of sergeants, for a total of approximately 60 men.
On starboard side, we had a mount on starboard side, and you can see there was a Marine Corps emblem on it. I say, hey, what's up with that? Oh, we man the mount. You know, the Marines man that. That's our mount. It's, you know, and they all talked about it was the cleanest mount. It was the fastest mount on the ship, and so I was kind of like, okay, cool. So and then I heard that, well, since you're the new guy, you're gonna do all the shitty stuff on the mount, which is, you know, you're at inside the mount loading magazines or whatever.
Another space associated with the Marine Corps, and one that doesn't show up as such on all of the Iowa-class battleships, is this Marine Corps Armory right outside the trash incinerator on second deck back aft. On some of the Iowa-class battleships, this is a pass-through between the bakery over here through to the incinerator and what either shows up as a butcher's shop or a donut shop, depending on the ship and the time period. So on New Jersey, there is no pass-through here, and it doesn't appear like there ever was one. So maybe that was an alteration made to later Iowa-class battleships. But because this was a dead-end hallway, by at least the 1980s, they had added this doorway here and turned it into the Marine Corps Armory. And there is a pair of racks in here that have enough room for approximately 100 rifles. Like we've already said, there were closer to 60 Marines assigned on board in the 80s, so the racks aren't all complete. And in addition to the traditional M16s of the time, the 1980s version, so the full-length M16 with the round handguards, I think that's an A2 model, there is probably room for other weapons like an M60 machine gun, which would have taken the role of the squad automatic weapon, and most likely there's room for some of the M16s to have been equipped with M203 40mm grenade launchers for the squad grenadiers. And presumably there were other types of weapons. That time period, you don't see individual soldiers getting scoped weapons a lot, and there would have probably been somebody as a designated marksman with some sort of scoped weapon in here. And there would have potentially also been shotguns. This is only one of several armories on board the ship, however. The Marines were supplemented by sailors who were armed. So some of the sailors, especially during World War II, could form a landing force, like we talked about earlier in the video, and they had their own locker and armory for landing force equipment. If you check out our video on the glory hole, you can see that space and how it looks today. The ship also had a master-at-arms who was something like the chief of police. So the ship's crew, the sailors of the crew, as opposed to the Marines, would have formed their own police force and they could have done quarterdeck watches, shore patrol, or guarding the ship when she was in port or underway. And so there are various safes, lockers, and armories around the ship for those sailors to draw their weapons from. But I'm fairly certain this is the only main one that the Marines drew from. Like I said, all of the rifles, squad automatic weapons, potentially heavier weapons, like it has been written that Iowa-class battleships were armed with at least 5 Stinger missiles. If you check out Summerall, I've never seen any evidence of them or any specific locker for them, although he says that there were ready service lockers around the superstructure. It does not appear to show up that way on New Jersey. And it doesn't really appear like they would have been stored in here with the Marine Corps equipment either. So in addition to this space where many of their weapons were stored, they do have the safe down below near where they berthed, and there were at least one of the magazine spaces around turret 3 was for Marine Corps ammunition. And there would have likely been some ready service ammunition stored up here to be issued with the weapons. And in addition to the rifles back here, we've got another safe here, which would have probably held your M1911 handguns, possibly M9s by the end of the ship's career. Possibly. This is probably also where armorers or gunnery sergeants, whoever serviced the weapons, would have done any of their inspection work here on this bench. And so, because this ship is a dead-end hallway way back inside the ship with something of a pit of death between it and the incinerator, it will likely never be on the tour route, which is why we're talking about it here. There are, however, a number of other spaces associated with the Marine Corps that you can see on the tour route. They had their own office. They would have been assigned to a 5-inch gun. In the 80s, it would have probably been the aftermost 5-inch gun mounts that the Marine Corps would have manned. I'm not sure where it would have been during World War II, but in combat, so that the Marines were useful, and because you probably aren't in a naval battle bringing people close enough to use rifles and machine guns, they would have manned a 5-inch gun. Right at the end of the 80s, the Marines were taken out of their 5-inch gun mount. And so some of the pictures in the 80s, you see the 5-inch gun mounts have globe and anchors painted on them. But right at the end of the ship's career, they removed them, put a traditional Navy gun crew in it, and retrained the Marines for manning our 25mm Bushmaster autocannon. This ship was never equipped with one, but the museum has found a pair, and you can see those on the tour route, in addition to their 5-inch gun. You can also see the brig, which would have likely been guarded by the Marines, and some of their offices and guard stations around the ship, including right by each of the batteries of Tomahawk cruise missiles. There is a guard station with a little doored booth with phones and other equipment in it, which brings us to why the ship had Marines reissued in the 80s.
So the way that the Marja worked, we're in charge of security for the ship, and basically the main part of the security was the Tomahawks. At the time, the Tomahawks were capable to carry special weapons, which were nuclear warheads. So that was one of the main parts of our security, was guarding those special weapons. And we, anytime they worked on those weapons, we had a 2-man rule. When the technicians were up there working on it, so anytime if there was 2 technicians on it, there always had to be 2 guys on it. There ought to be 2 guys watching them. Special weapons, it's a whole different deal.
On a modern ship, a contemporary ship today, the sailors do all of the police work that the Marines would have traditionally done, and all of the guard detail. On this ship, you can even see that with the Master at Arms force in addition to the Marines, and both having their own small arms and stations around the ship. However, the one exception in the modern Navy are nuclear-powered surface ships. And that same exception existed in the 80s. Obviously, Iowa-class battleships aren't nuclear-powered, but they could be equipped with nuclear weapons in the form of warheads for the Tomahawk cruise missiles. And the Navy claims that the Iowa-class battleships, surface ships in general, they will not confirm that they ever had nuclear weapons on board. However, the crew seems to think that they did, and the fact that we had Marine Corps guards assigned to the ship, and the fact that they would have guarded some but not all of the missiles, tends to heavily imply that that was part of the reasoning for assigning Marines to the battleships in the 80s. Thanks for watching. Do you have any experience with Marines on your ship? Let us know in the comment section down below. Battleship New Jersey receives operating support from the New Jersey Department of State, and also from a number of other sources, including other businesses and individuals like yourselves. And the private donations you guys have made specifically to our YouTube channel has allowed us to grow from doing one video a week to doing multiple videos a week. So remember to like, share, and subscribe to get notified when that new content is coming out. And check the link in the description for ways you can support the ship. Thanks for watching. That's interesting.